Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining today's Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force webinar session, where we're going to be taking some time to look at transport and energy planning in support of accelerating uptake of electric vehicles and some of the challenges and opportunities facing local areas. My name is Richard Halsey and I'm Director at the Energy Systems Catapult, and I'm just going to give you a quick overview of our agenda for this afternoon's session. So if I can move on to the first slide, please. Thank you. So first up, we have Jonathan Murray from the Zemo partnership, who is going to give us a quick context update on the Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force, its activity and its planned next steps. Then I'm going to give you some background on why EVET considers improving planning and coordination such an important part to enabling the electric vehicle transition. Then Cheryl Hiles from Energy Capital in the West Midlands is going to give us a local perspective on the current challenges and opportunities related to the electrification of transport. I'm going to then give you a quick overview of some of the work from one of EVET's latest working groups, looking at the key considerations in providing support and guidance to local areas in delivering public EV charging. Then following on from this, Antony Henderson from OZEV is going to give us an update on the work OZEV is doing on developing guidance specifically for local authorities. We're then going to have a panel discussion on what needs to happen to deliver public EV charging as an integrated part of local energy systems in different places around the country, the challenges and opportunities that represents. And then finally, Andrew Larkham from OZEV is going to give us an update on the local EV infrastructure fund. I'm going to be looking for questions, particularly for the panel session, to put to our panel members. So if you can post these in the Q&A board, that would be fantastic. And we'll try and pull out some of these for the panel discussion. And there'll also be an opportunity to ask Andrew some questions on the EV infrastructure fund as well at the end. So again, if people could post any particular questions on this in the Q&A section as well, that would be great. Okay, so I hope we've got an interesting next hour or so ahead of us, some interesting discussion and debate. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Jonathan Murray at the Zemo partnership to just give us a little bit of context with regard to the Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force. So I think next slide, please, and over to Jonathan.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Richard, for that introduction. As Richard said, I'm Jonathan Murray from the Zemo partnership. You may have heard of us previously as the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership. We rebranded and renamed ourselves earlier this year because low is no longer good enough. The target is around net zero emissions mobility is our aim. Our role at Zemo partnership, we're acting as the coordinator for the EV Energy Task Force, which we were asked to form back in 2018 by BEIS and OZEV. And at the time, we formed the task force to tackle the issue of how to ensure that the energy system wasn't a blocker to the mass uptake of EVs in the coming decade. And we originally produced our recommendations in January of 2020, putting forward 21 proposals of actions that needed to be taken to ensure that the energy system wasn't a blocker, but also, and probably more fundamentally, to ensure that the EV user and the consumer is put at the heart of everything that we do. That was a very well received report, both by government and by industry. And as a result of that, the EV Energy Task Force was asked to continue in a role of ensuring or overseeing the development of the EV charging landscape to keep at pace with the developments in the marketing of EVs. And that's the job we've done. Last summer, we went into an exercise of mapping out where activity was taking place against the 21 proposals that we identified, ensuring that those proposals were still relevant, identifying where progress was being made, and more importantly, where progress was lagging behind or needed to be prioritised. And we produced a list of 10 areas that needed priority action. And of those, 6 of those we were asked by government to take forward and to provide some way forward, some mechanisms of coming up with actionable proposals in those areas. And that's what we've been doing over the last 12 months. And this leads us here to today, where we're going to be hearing of the third in a series of 4 webinars looking at those priority actions and the draft proposals and recommendations that are coming out of those working groups. That then brings us to a bit of a watershed. We are about to enter a new phase for the EV Energy Taskforce, one where we're working much more in an integrated way with both the EV supply chain in the UK, the marketing of EVs, and the provision of infrastructure, and ensuring not only that the technical issues are put in place to allow charging of EVs and the energy system to work together, but also starting to look at where those charge points should be and where that infrastructure should be, and how to prioritize and ensure that we have the energy system, along with the transport authorities, along with the automotive sector, working in parallel. And that's very much the focus of today's theme. We expect to be making an announcement very shortly about further activity to take us forward. And that will be a new role that will be going forward for the EV Energy Taskforce, working in conjunction with something called the Road Transport Transition Council, which is shortly to be announced. But back to today, and the role of coordinating planning and providing guidance to local authorities. So with that, I'll pass back to Richard to take us through the rest of the presentations. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for that sort of quick overview. And if anybody kind of is interested in any more information around the Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force and what it's doing, please do reach out to Jonathan and the team at the Zemo partnership to find out what's been done historically and also what's on the horizon, as he said. Okay, now what I'm going to do is just building on some of what Jonathan has said, is give you a little bit sort of more context and information around why the Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force felt that planning and coordination is such an important building block in delivering EV charging infrastructure that we need, and something that's going to support our net zero ambitions, as Jonathan so rightly set out there. So if you can perhaps move on to the next slide for me. So as Jonathan outlined, the original sort of Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force identified 21 proposals which were within 5 key theme areas. The first theme, to deliver consumers benefits through improved interoperability of charging solutions. The second theme, to sufficiently reward consumers for charging more smartly. The third theme, for utilising and protecting data to deliver better outcomes for consumers. The fourth theme, very importantly, winning consumers' trust and confidence both in electric vehicles but also in the charging experiences that consumers have. And the fifth theme, developing and maintaining the charging infrastructure that we as EV drivers will need, and that is going to build that confidence and trust that is so important in accelerating the transition of electric vehicles. So if you can move on to the next slide. It's that final theme 5 that really identified that both national and local planning and coordination was going to be absolutely key to delivering an EV charging experience that is needed, but also to deliver that very importantly in a way that is both cost effective in terms of integrating charging as part of wider national and local energy systems, and ensuring that it supports our commitments to decarbonisation. What's become increasingly evident since the kind of initial proposal recommended it, there's a real risk that not only do we see widespread cases of poorly maintained and inadequate provision of charging, but that we potentially see an increasing disparity of charging experience across the country. There's a real risk that we see something of a postcode lottery starting to emerge, and that it is very likely that you could see areas where the charging experience is well managed, well coordinated, well planned, and other areas much less so. And that acts in itself as a real brake to consumer confidence and ultimately to the uptake of electric vehicles. So recognizing that and continually sort of seeing that as a real important aspect of kind of what needs to happen. If you move on to the next slide, the Electric Vehicle Energy Taskforce set out a vision of a well-planned, well-coordinated public EV charging network across the UK. And that is something that actually enables things like smart charging and creates the foundational building blocks to ensure that electric vehicles and their interaction are a coordinated and effective part of our future energy system. And that the use of more open and more real-time data and information delivers us as consumers better charging and mobility experiences that are developing and maturing over time. And that this also ensures a more efficient and much less carbon intensive energy system overall that ultimately supports our net zero ambitions. There's a real risk not only do we have a patchwork of EV charging solutions across the UK that doesn't deliver great consumer experiences, but also a risk that how we manage that charging doesn't ultimately support and deliver our net zero and carbon reduction ambitions. So in order that we're able to achieve that vision, as Jonathan was outlining there, in this fifth theme, EVET set out 3 key proposals to support that more effective planning and coordination. So these 3 key proposals from the original work of the Electric Vehicle Energy Taskforce are shared here. And don't worry, I'm not going to sort of recite them word for word. And what I've tried to do here is kind of cartoon them into 3 sort of key buckets. The first is that better planning and coordination of public EV charging as part of national and local energy systems. And this really means thinking in a more sophisticated way about the type, location, and interaction of EV charging with the wider energy system. And also that this is not done in complete isolation from other changes to local energy systems, which we are likely to see as we move towards decarbonisation and our net zero goals. It also means an important connection between both the aspects of transport planning and future mobility and energy planning, something that has been quite often historically seen in 2 distinct silos and managed in a way with very, very light touch points. The electrification of transport potentially creates the need for a much closer connection between transport and energy planning as a way of managing both the risks, but also realizing the opportunities that are to be had from the electrification of transport. We are seeing increasing interest and activity in response to the commitment to net zero, and many network operators and local areas are actively engaging with the concept of local area energy planning since these proposals were made, which are really positive steps forward. Although more structured support and guidance is likely to be needed, and something that I think we'll be touching on a little bit later. The second of these proposals was that the price control for the network operators enables investment in network infrastructure to support EV charging. And since this proposal was made, the progress on RIIO-2 has set out its commitment to support net zero through improved forecasting of demand caused by electric vehicles and other low growth drivers, and also a dedicated net zero reopener mechanism to be able to come back and look again at the investment that's needed to deliver on net zero progress and commitments. However, it has to be said that Ofgem has stopped short of requiring the use of local decentralized planning and low growth forecasting. It is not, however, sort of on a positive note, it is not restricted network operators from proactively engaging and working with local and regional stakeholders to understand what their local plans mean in terms of energy, transport and housing, and how that might affect and be relevant to network development. And in them using this to inform network investments where projections for anticipated demand can be well justified. And we're seeing lots of proactive, positive steps being taken by different local areas, by different network operators in starting to think about how does this stakeholder engagement and dialogue around what net zero actually means for places and what it means for network investment progressing and being taken forward. The third is for central government to provide more support and guidance to local areas, not only in planning, but also in developing, procuring, operating and maintaining public EV charging. This has been looked at a little further through the Electric Vehicle Energy Taskforce, and we're going to touch on this shortly. I'm going to give a bit of an overview of some of the work that has been done within one of the working groups, as Jonathan outlined, thinking a little bit about what's that support need to comprise? What is it that's out there already? How do we need to ensure that the right level of support in the right way is provided to local areas? And there's no doubt that we are seeing some really great examples of local leadership supporting the electrification of transport and scaling up the provision of public EV charging. But as I said earlier, there's also a growing sense of this real patchwork emerging across the UK and challenges both in terms of capacity and capability in different places. And that this is creating both regional and kind of potential national risks in terms of how we are able to align and coordinate various different endeavours coming forward. It's very clear that not only does this creating challenges within local government, but it potentially also is creating challenges for industry and how it responds and delivers EV charging solutions collaboratively with different places, and how that we ensure that there is a common and shared understanding of what is needed between national government, local government and industry in delivering the outcomes that we're all working towards. So it's both a land of challenge and opportunity at the moment. We're seeing some great examples of fantastic work and collaboration coming forward. We're seeing progress on the kind of regulatory environment and support mechanisms, but there's certainly still much more to be done. And there's a clear sense in local areas as well of both that challenge and opportunity. And in that context, what I'd like to do now is pass over to Cheryl from Energy Capital, who's going to give us a little bit of a heads up on the local perspective on those challenges and opportunities. So Cheryl, without any further ado, if I can perhaps hand over to you, if the technology works okay, to give us a little bit of an overview from your perspective. Cheryl.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. And hello everybody, good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me today. So my name is Cheryl Hiles, I'm Director of Energy Capital. And as Richard said, I've been asked today to give a bit of a local perspective. I'll talk a little bit about the challenges and the risks as well as the opportunities. So if we could go to the next slide, please. And for those of you who don't know us, Energy Capital is a partnership. We're based in the West Midlands, as Richard said. We've got responsibility for delivering the regional energy strategy, but as part of that, we work very closely with our local authorities in the region to make sure that we can secure the powers, the responsibilities and the resources to actually deliver on that, because energy isn't a statutory responsibility of local authorities. However, it is a statutory responsibility they have a statutory responsibility for transport, and as part of the West Midlands Combined Authority, we have Transport for West Midlands, who are the local transport body. So we're sort of interesting place where we have responsibility for both transport and some energy aspects. So this is obviously where this all comes together. Can we move to the next slide, please? So some of the challenges that are faced sort of on the ground when you're looking at these things, I'm going to look at it from a fairly strategic perspective, but there's obviously lots and lots of practical things that our colleagues get involved in all the time that are particularly challenging, but just sort of raising the level a little bit and looking strategically. Obviously, we have to make sure that we're investing public money wisely. So any funds that are invested into network charging facilities obviously have to be done in the same kind of fashion that the private sector investment takes It has to look really carefully at what you're investing in and whether it's a sensible use of public funds. And there's always the concern of having not made those investments correctly and ending up with assets that are redundant or not utilised in any way in the future. So there's kind of strategic issues that the market face are still faced by the public sector, even if they're the ones who are driving some of this activity. And it's also difficult because obviously we're aware that the market demand isn't there yet. We know that if it was, then the private sector would be delivering a lot of what's required. The demand could be really significant, but equally, as innovation is happening so quickly in the sector, and we spend a lot of time at Energy Capital working with the team and the Energy Systems Catapult and others on innovation, and we see that changing the way in which the sort of future of the market is going to open up in all sorts of areas. So innovation could well obviously reduce the need for the charging infrastructure that's required today over time. So that makes it a very sort of risky platform, makes it difficult to know what the right decisions are when you're thinking about investing public money wisely. Another challenge, particularly for the public sector, is around at the local level, is around roles and responsibilities. So particularly if I think about it from the perspective of Transport for West Midlands, who obviously we work really closely with, they have a responsibility for mobility and transport planning as a whole, and a much greater emphasis on public transport services than they perhaps do on how they can influence the private transport, probably because there's more levers. They have the opportunity to actually deliver, excuse me, to deliver public transport services. So in terms of the planning process, a lot of that is focused on kind of the whole mobility space and what we can do to support that transition and decarbonisation across the whole of the transport aspects. As a result of that, public transport is one of the key areas that we focus on, and obviously also needs to be decarbonised. But I think that will offer some opportunities, which I'll perhaps come to later. And the other thing is obviously around local geography. So as a local area, we're responsible for our own space, and the West Midlands in particular has some challenges that others do too, but we are particularly an interchange. So being in the middle of the country, being able to access most of the rest of the UK through similar timeframes, actually we end up being an interchange. So our role as part of the national system is just as important as our role as a local area. So when we're thinking about charging provision, we tend to want to know what's going on nationally and want to see how we can work with and facilitate those who are travelling through our region as much as those who are travelling around the region. So essentially what we're trying to do when we sort of look at the transport infrastructure planning and what we can do to support that decarbonisation process, it's always about looking at the least pathways of least regret. So what can we do now that we know is the right investment, and how do we know that it will help to achieve the goals in the future? If you think about it from the other perspective, so that's sort of coming at it from a transport perspective, think about it from an energy perspective, bearing in mind Energy Capital spends most of its time working with the distribution network operators and others on the energy side. There isn't much planning that goes on around the low voltage network, particularly in our distribution network operator area. So planning right down to the minutiae of details of where electric vehicle charging points are going to be is not something that the network operator does. But having said that, we're very, very aware of the constraints that the network faces. The image on the left of your screen is just a heat map of some of the areas that are hugely constrained from a network perspective. And we know that even the small connections can trigger upgrades and can, which can mean that then that the business models for those connections is just not viable. So far, excuse me, the processes that Richard alluded to earlier of some of the ways in which the distribution network operators are engaging with local authorities and others to try and gain more information about what their plans are, what's likely to come forward, and how that might influence and affect the distribution network. Some of those processes still aren't working for us yet, so they're definitely improving, but we're still not at a point yet where the local authorities and the network planners are speaking the same language, or using the same data, or really are clear on what is actually needed to achieve the goals that they both have. So the map on the right hand side of the screen shows a number of dots. I don't know whether you can see them, but the green dots are all the data that we put into the call for evidence that Western Power recently put out with regard to the green recovery, so where we expected to put transport related connection requests in. And the purple dots are where there is likely to be some reinforcement investment taking place. So you'll see that those don't correlate very well, which means that all of those green dots are likely to struggle to get sort of affordable network connections, which basically shows us at the moment that we're not getting the information to the DNO that's required to help them with some of their case making too often as to why investment's needed. And I think Richard alluded to earlier, the reopeners are a great opportunity, but just what's required to justify investment isn't quite clear yet. So there's quite a lot to do there. So for us, we've realised also that silos are really difficult. They're a classic problem in the public sector, but silos really make this more and more difficult. So for example, the distribution network operator is keen to understand all of the impacts on their networks, but the way in which the local authority is currently operating, they don't necessarily think energy first. Energy is often thought of at the end of a process as part of the development process. So as a result, you don't see where there might be opportunities to reinforce the network, perhaps by bringing together applications that are likely to be in one particular place. So you see inefficiencies in relation to the upgrade process. So for us, that kind of place-based approach, looking and bringing energy first, could be really important. And also having a common language is really important, hence why we use a lot of mapping, because GIS tends to be a fairly common language. But even just the word infrastructure means a whole lot of things to different people. So if you have a transport planner and an energy planner in the same room, the word infrastructure does not mean the same thing. It can mean a road, it can mean a charging point, or it can mean a pipe or a wire. So I think that's another thing that we really need to get right in terms of a common understanding of language. And one of the things we're doing within the combined authority is consulting on a strategy for strategy for infrastructure for zero emission vehicles over the summer, so that we can start to be clear on the language and who means what and what's actually required to enable us to move forward. So in terms of opportunities, what can we do? I think the fact that we local authorities are responsible for mobility as a whole presents a really exciting opportunity. If the public sector is making large-scale investments into electrical connections for their bus fleet, for their rail fleet, for other fleet vehicles, there is definitely the opportunity to use that to try and address some of the challenges that we might face when putting individual charging applications into the DNO. So for example, charging depots for buses will generally draw on power at night. You might obviously find if you're putting public charging in for private vehicles, then that tends to be drawing mainly during the day. So there might be opportunities to look at profiling different types of charging to make sure that you can get a connection that supports that. So bringing the different types of technology together gives an opportunity to perhaps support one over another. From our point of view, using the public sector investments into perhaps large-scale public transport and how to decarbonise that to then support the private transition really helps, because we can't afford for the decarbonisation of the transport sector to all be about private vehicles and private vehicle ownership. In terms of it being a just transition and taking everybody with us, it's really important that that's not the case. And that for us, we can see opportunities perhaps to not necessarily support individual electric vehicle charging, but perhaps the development of car clubs and those kind of what I often call the sort of third sector opportunities that can enable that transition and mean that everybody has access and fair access, which is really important to us. And again, something I think Richard mentioned earlier. Another opportunity that might occur if we think about this from a place-based point of view is the opportunity to bring generation and use together through the spatial planning process. That might again help overcome some of the network constraints that exist, and enable to just show how we can use better planning to align objectives. So what we're trying to do at the moment, I think it's quite clear that we're unlikely to be able to align the local planning process from a spatial point of view, the transport planning process, and the energy networks planning process. They are they're very, very different systems under different timescales, regulated by different authorities. So the idea of aligning those, I think, is probably a step too far. But what we are trying to do at the moment is look at how we can bring those people who are responsible for each of those together. And we are about to set up what we're calling a West Midlands Net Zero Delivery Board of people who are responsible for investment in infrastructure. And we mean infrastructure in the really broadest sense there, where we mean housing, transport, and the electrical gas networks, and maybe even water as well, where that really pulls on the need for net zero, and to see if we can collaborate, see if collaboration can lead to better outcomes. So we're going to try and test that. And if it doesn't, or even if it does, but it highlights there's some other opportunities, the other thing we're trying to do is work together with local authorities across the country to call for greater powers and responsibility for achieving net zero. So, and I think that would provide the foundation that perhaps Richard's talking about, in terms of it's not just about the planning, but it's also about the delivery. So if we can get the planning processes at least working together, using the same inputs and producing the same outputs, then we might be in a better position to ensure that the delivery is aligned as well. That's all from me.
Brilliant, thanks, Cheryl. That's great. I think Cheryl's contact details up there on the table, on the slide. And if people have got any questions, we're obviously going to have the panel session shortly. So if people have any particular questions or anything, if they want to put those in the Q&A session, we'll try and kind of get to those. I mean, Cheryl, firstly, thank you. I mean, a really great overview, and I think sort of chiming and highlighting a lot of kind of really interesting points, particularly around that challenge of navigating uncertainty, which is obviously kind of a really big one in delivery of public EV charging solutions. Wonderfully calling out the language point. I think that's one that quite often we really do fundamentally underestimate, how actually in different areas, and when areas start to collide, as we are seeing with transport and energy getting much closer, actually just having that common understanding of what do we mean by certain ones. And as you highlight, Cheryl, the term infrastructure is certainly one of those that is sort of fraught with different takes on what that means. And I think through the Electric Vehicle Energy Taskforce, Jonathan and others will be very familiar that there's been lots of debate and discussion about drawing the lines around what we mean by infrastructure. And I think as you said, Cheryl, as we bring that kind of connectivity close together, it's really important that that language is kind of clear and well understood, and the use of kind of locational information can be a really helpful and valuable kind of way of doing that. And also I like the idea of this interchange between local and national. I think that's a really sort of interesting kind of concept, as acting as an interchange or a bridge between the kind of things that need to happen at a national level and the things that really need kind of local kind of implementation. And there's potentially all kinds of lessons that we can learn from the kind of the management and the decision making and the planning and coordination around the pandemic that might have some parallels here, and people might have some thoughts on that for the panel discussion slightly later. So again, thanks, Cheryl. I'll just move on now quickly to the next slide if we can. So I'm just going to now very quickly give a little bit of an overview of some of the work that's been kind of done most recently, thinking about that third pillar that I outlined from the Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force's proposals, and providing better supports to local areas to deliver public EV charging. So I think Cheryl's really sort of articulately set out some of the kind of risks and challenges, but also the opportunities that are there for kind of local planning, delivery, and ultimately implementation kind of EV charging solutions. But what actually is needed to help kind of deliver that? What are the support mechanisms that need to be put in place to be able to do that? It was originally called out that the absence of that support was a real issue, and that there was a kind of, whilst there might be quite often a lot of desire and appetite to do things, that actually the kind of the foundational support mechanisms weren't really in place in the way that they needed to be, and that was something that I think was recognised by a lot of stakeholders. So yes, as I said, specifically Proposal 21 identified the need for central government to provide more support and guidance to help particularly local areas, and local government was identified, but not just exclusively, to provide, I guess, a wide range of stakeholders additional support and guidance to help and support the delivery of public EV charging infrastructure. So as I said, as part of the EVET's latest activity, a working group was formed to kind of consider what those needs were, who the stakeholders that might need to be involved and to be thought about, and what need to be considered in terms of the provision of that support and guidance. And Antony, a little bit later, I think, is going to be giving us a bit of an overview of the work that OZEV is doing in developing guidance specifically for local authorities. But this was very much broadly thinking about, well, what is kind of going on, what exists, what are the challenges and problems with what exists today, and what needs to happen kind of going, or needs to be thought about and considered in developing guidance and support mechanisms going forward. So that sort of working group combined a combination of local government, academia, industry, specialist transport and energy research organisations, kind of collaboratively thinking about this. And it very much did call out a number of those points I think that Cheryl was making about this need for a much closer connectivity between kind of transport and energy professions, for want of a word. One of the common kind of issues that was called out was that actually these things are dealt with and managed and handled in quite separate kind of buckets within different organisations. The touch points were in some cases fleeting, and as Cheryl highlighted, that the language and the nomenclature was actually quite different and very difficult, and in some cases felt to be quite impenetrable. And I know from my own personal experience working in energy for kind of longer than I care to remember now, actually you do become a little bit almost immune sometimes to the acronyms that you use and the language that you kind of take for granted that people kind of understand what you're talking about. So there is something kind of really important about breaking down those barriers and making those connections. But if you move on to the next slide, one of the first things that did is really start to look at and think about the kind of stakeholder landscape in the space, and what that found was a kind of rapidly evolving and developing landscape of stakeholders. And it ended up wrestling that to the ground and categorizing that into 6 broad categories. The first being the sort of public bodies and authorities involved in public EV charging. The second being the wider energy system stakeholders, as Cheryl alluded to, her the energy network operators, but not just the distribution network operators, but also the wider transmission and energy system operator. And also what was being felt was being lost was the new market participants, like, you know, aggregation businesses, but also energy retailers, energy suppliers, becoming obviously an increasingly important part of how consumers are kind of connecting with their kind of EV energy usage. And lots of innovative businesses thinking and looking at dynamic tariff arrangements and trying to connect more directly with the EV kind of user market, as well as a kind of segment of their consumer market. The third, obviously, charge point delivery stakeholders, so be that from charge point operators, but also the installers, manufacturers, potentially a range of future charge point service providers. The fourth, obviously, the providers of vehicles and the kind of related user groups themselves, so the OEMs. But also, what was flagged was a kind of growing interest of kind of community and municipal kind of interest groups, thinking about what's the role that they can play in helping the delivery of public EV charging. What is the kind of potential opportunity, particularly for serving areas that run the risk of being underserved or kind of not served at all because of viability, and where there might be kind of different delivery mechanisms that could exist. And also, as Cheryl kind of highlighted, more broadly than passenger vehicle kind of charging, bus and fleet kind of operators. Obviously, a wide range of kind of industry bodies and associations and different organisations kind of across the piece. And then finally, the sixth one, those sort of cross-cutting kind of organisations, whether that's from organisations looking at specifically research, but also a growing pool of kind of advisors and consultants who are kind of supporting different businesses in kind of evaluating kind of the options for charge point infrastructure, but also then taking it through into delivery, working very directly with local government, but also directly with businesses in different forms and ways. So, and what the really interesting thing with the stakeholder group was that not only was it quite difficult in wrestling to the ground a stakeholder kind of definition and grouping for today, it was incredibly difficult to define what the evolution of that stakeholder landscape was going to look like, and the potential for those stakeholders and the roles that they were playing to evolve quite rapidly and in quite different ways going forward as well. And that therefore providing kind of guidance, supporting information needed to be incredibly cognizant of not just the kind of landscape today, but how that was going to evolve and how the needs of those different stakeholders were going to potentially evolve and change over time as well. So I think one of the fact that sort of wider sort of stakeholder landscape is kind of changing and evolving so much, just a real need to try and think and understand how that is going to be responded to, and also how it's going to kind of be continually evaluated, and the information and guidance and support it's providing is being able to effectively respond to that. So and what was done next was looking very much at the kind of landscape of existing support mechanisms, be that resources, guidance that was available to kind of stakeholder communities, and particularly kind of to kind of local stakeholders. And what this found was a very, very complex kind of almost something of a spaghetti soup of information, where there was actually quite a large range of information available to stakeholders. Lots and lots of guidance being produced nationally, internationally, locally, from a business perspective, from a very sort of narrow kind of interest perspective to a very broad and strategic perspective. And then some of that information, is really, really, fantastic stuff, really high quality resources, high quality guidance and information. But one of the real barriers that was being found was, whilst there was a really high quality and depth of kind of information coming from very many different sources, it was really difficult and unclear to see, in many cases, just simply what was the most contemporary and what is the most authoritative and appropriate source of information and guidance for somebody to be using. So what is the most up to date, the thing that I need to look at, that I should be looking at, the thing that I should be following in thinking about delivering kind of public EV charging in my area of responsibility? What's the kind of the latest piece of information? What is the one that I should definitely be following and responding to? And that was very, very, very confused, very difficult. There was a sense that people were struggling to understand what represented kind of good practice, what represented best practice, what represented kind of something that was still very much formative and kind of innovative in nature, and what was actually something that really should be kind of almost the drumbeat of business as usual. And there was also a lot of kind of gaps in information being looked after. Lots of cases of new information coming out and being provided to various different stakeholders, and to providing them kind of snippets in time of kind of what needs to happen, but very little evidence of how that information was then being maintained, organized and looked after in a way that made sense for different stakeholders, particularly for kind of local area stakeholders, local government, local authority, which I think Antony is probably going to touch on some of the thinking that's happening there on the OZEV side. And therefore, how did it best kind of respond and evolve to kind of developing and changing needs? Quite often information jumping into a very, very high degree of technical depth without actually necessarily having kind of the more strategic kind of macro decision-making information being kind of made available, and the key considerations, or likewise sitting at a very strategic and high level, but not actually providing the level of depth and kind of support and information that was needed to be able to move something forward. So there's clearly a sense that there is need for something that is more organized, more structured. It's very clear for many stakeholders as to how you kind of get at it, where you go to get at that supported information, and then how you kind of move through and navigate through that information, recognizing that there is kind of different needs through a journey of sorts in terms of delivering public EV charging. So what this work did is it sort of wrestled to the ground from that sort of looking at the kind of the stakeholder landscape, from looking at kind of what was out there and what was being used and how it was kind of coming together, a series of I think what's dubbed here as almost requirements for consideration. So things that really, in terms of producing and providing guidance, needs to be thought about and needs to be kind of on the list of kind of important considerations. The first of those is that guidance needs to be accessible, well maintained, and remain relevant. We found lots of cases, I think, of good information, but it just wasn't being kept up to date, or it was actually very, very inaccessible. It was kind of hidden. You had to really be able to navigate, be the web or be kind of a particular organizational kind of hierarchy and information structures to be able to get at the information that was needed. And the second, that there needs to be a real clarity and connection between bits of authoritative information. So we found lots of information, for example, supporting aspects of the public EV charging journey that maybe then wasn't really owned by the organizations responsible for that journey and wasn't effectively signposting. So, for example, with regard network connection with the distribution network operator, or with regards to joining up conversations around transport and energy planning, there was places where it clearly felt that you could just, in effect, make some better connections between kind of authoritative and recognized pieces of information, and that would help all the stakeholder communities be able to move forward together more cohesively. The third one, that sort of evolving stakeholder landscape needs to be factored, and that any guidance and resources need to not be set in stone and be able to recognize that and respond to that evolving landscape. The fourth one, that it needs to align really very much to a common journey for public EV charging, and that there was a sense of actually that there wasn't a common understanding of the steps that, particularly kind of local stakeholders might go through from kind of initial kind of visions and concepts right through to kind of practical implementation and delivery. The fifth one, that I think again Cheryl sort of highlighted, this need to try and support this connection between energy and transport planning, but I think it's also possibly beyond planning. It's about then ultimately kind of coordinated implementation and delivery at a national and local level. The sixth one, that the clear need for some recognized go-to focal point for information. So somewhere of really knowing that that's the place you go to for the kind of key information, and then how that sort of splinters out across and makes connections to kind of other pieces of information. And then the final one there, really thinking about what a long-term strategy for upkeep and for future development of kind of information and resources is, and how it ensures that is given enough consideration kind of at the outset, and that there's a plan for longevity, recognizing that there are lots of information out there at the moment. Is some of it's fantastic, but really just hasn't had that plan for kind of longevity and upkeep. So there were sort of 7 of the key requirements that emerged from kind of one of the working group's activities. And if you move on to the next slide, and building on that sort of requirement for this kind of more clearly defined journey to support kind of the delivery of public EV charging, there's some work sort of done looking at kind of how that might be structured and kind of what we're doing, and what was kind of defined was these sort of 6 kind of key areas or steps on that journey that support and guidance and information was kind of really needed around. The first one being the sort of vision and local policy making for public EV charging. So the guidance and support that's needed in both setting a vision, but also then translating that into local policy making. As Cheryl kind of outlined earlier, I see a lot of kind of transport planning and kind of other mobility decisions are kind of held at a kind of local or regional level. So how can you make those kind of connections and provide supporting information around that area first? The second, the planning and design of public EV charging. So the support that's needed to actually practically translate a vision or a policy position into practical plans for implementation and ultimately designs. The third one, procurement of public EV charging, so something that was recognised by many stakeholders, that actually the mechanisms by which procurement is approached, how that is structured, kind of quite different approaches, and that there could be a real benefit in a degree of standardisation and kind of common definition of what sort of good and best practice kind of looks like. The fourth area, installation, operation and maintenance of public charging. So guidance on ensuring that both the installation, operation and maintenance is kind of undertaken, the contracts that need to be put in place, the things that need to be considered in specifying works, the possible pitfalls and risks that can be faced. Again, an area where there's kind of been lots of learning and there's lots of evidence of kind of knowledge transfer, but no single sort of focal point where you can kind of get at that information and you can ensure that that's being thought about in terms of delivering public EV charging. The fifth one, network connections. Kind of came out very strongly as a number of issues and areas and potential opportunities for kind of innovation, but also just as again Cheryl highlighted earlier, potentially lack of access to information, data, lack of a common language and understanding of what's being considered and how plans for kind of network investments might or might not align with kind of local plans for delivery of public EV charging. And the sixth and final one was really just sharing best practice and findings from research. A huge amount of research being done around the kind of risks, opportunities, a lot of international, but also national and local best practice kind of emerging, and no real kind of focal point for being able to get at that and being able to kind of see that in a kind of coordinated, organized way, and to be able to learn from kind of what's happening around the country. So and also internationally, I mean, that was one that kind of came out quite strongly, that a lot of kind of examples and best practice happening internationally, but maybe not being able to kind of access those and be able to kind of translate and apply the learnings, and also a lot of work happening in both academia and research organizations, and making sure that can be kind of seen and accessed, and that both, this is not only necessarily just findings, but also potentially data and kind of information from those experiences are made accessible and can be shared. So that was sort of the 6 key steps of a journey that it was felt that guidance and information would be helpful to be thought about in how it was being structured and how it was being provided. And I think that segues in kind of nicely to the work that kind of OZEV has been doing, thinking about providing kind of better guidance and information specifically to kind of local authorities around EV infrastructure. So I think that's probably a prime point for me to segue across to Antony to give us a bit of an update on the work that OZEV has been doing in this space. So Antony, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, and hello, everyone. So, yeah, my name's Antony. I work in OZEV. I'm currently the head of work, home, and destination EV charging policy, so quite a broad title there. And wanted to kind of discuss the local authority guides that we're putting together, reflecting on the feedback that we got from EVAT and where we've got to with that guidance. So, can we go on to the next slide, please? So, to set some of the context, back in our Road to Zero strategy in 2018, we kind of set out that we thought local authorities have a crucial role to play in the transition to zero-emission vehicles, and that's through the provision of EV charging infrastructure, particularly for those who don't have off-street parking, but also for taxi drivers, fleets, and light delivery vehicle drivers. There's also a key role for local authorities to play in electrifying their own fleet and providing the infrastructure for that. We have a number of support mechanisms at the minute for local authorities to roll out that EV infrastructure, the main one being the on-street residential charging scheme. £20 million has been made available for that in 21-22, and that's available to all local authorities to apply to get EV infrastructure in their local areas. Andrew Larkham will be speaking a little bit later on about the Local Infrastructure Fund, which will also be aiming to support in this area. So we know that local authorities face a number of barriers in planning and implementing EV charging infrastructure. The previous speakers have detailed that in quite a lot of detail. But one of the main ones when we did some consultation was about the knowledge and expertise within this relatively new area of technology was cited as a barrier amongst officers within local authorities. And as Richard said, there was a clear need for an authoritative piece of guide here. There was a lot of different pieces of guidance out there. It wasn't clear how they all fitted together, and it wasn't clear how they should be used. In light of the feedback from EVET and what I just discussed there, OZEV set out to create a single point of reference for local authorities to use to assess them in rolling out EV infrastructure. The guidance is intended to be authoritative. It's meant to create a route from beginning to end on how to get infrastructure into the ground, and it should be applicable to all local authorities across the country, no matter if that's county councils or district councils. It should be applicable to all, and it should be a one-stop guide. We've commissioned the Institute for Engineering and Technology to produce the guide, primarily because they've got good expertise in this area and have done similar pieces of guidance in the past. So the scope of the guidance. Like I said, it's meant to be, I like the word on the slide, the practical pathway to installing and implementing EV infrastructure. So this includes choosing the best EV charge point for your area, considerations prior to installations, show DNO engagement. The previous speakers have discussed a lot about DNO engagement and mapping out where grid capacity is, and we really try to pull out in this guidance. Early engagement with DNOs is absolutely vital in order to get this charging infrastructure into the ground in a strategic way. And then there's other areas as well, like TROs and licenses. We're going to discuss consumer experience. As I'm sure you're aware, OZEV recently consulted on introducing new legislation for consumer experience to mandate payment methods and interoperability and things like that. We're going to discuss operational ownership models. I think Richard discussed that in detail, and that was something that was really needed. And we're going to talk about post-installation and maintenance within the guidance. The guidance won't be providing technical details on how to physically install the charge point, because that's covered elsewhere and that's covered in standards. This is meant to be the considerations that should be made to get charge points in the ground. And I think the other thing that I should have probably brought out on this slide was that this should probably be read in line alongside the upcoming EV infrastructure strategy that OZEV are producing, which will kind of set out the roles and responsibilities from our perspective of local authorities and other key stakeholders, industry and national government, and set out that strategic view of how charging infrastructure and the transition should go ahead. This should be read alongside that. So, progress today. We had initial workshops a few months ago. There was 16 plus local authorities on that call, and we kind of set out what we thought the current scope of the guidance should be, and kind of asked for their feedback and their input and what they would like to see from that guidance. Post those workshops, we engaged further with local authorities. So we used the LGA's contact list, we used the local council's road innovation group contact list and EST themselves to kind of send that finalized scope out to local authorities, gather more feedback, make sure this was really hitting home, really getting to the kind of the detail that local authorities needed to be able to kind of go forward and start installing this infrastructure in a more coherent way. We got a lot of feedback from that wider stakeholder engagement, which is absolutely fantastic. So since that point, we've been doing a lot of drafting. We've got a good working document together now. It's with our technical committee, which is made up of industry experts and some local authorities as well, and it's with them for comment. So currently going back through that redraft process, and it's looking in it's in a very good place at the moment. So going forward, so we're currently in the redraft stage post technical committee, so feeding in all their comments, making sure it's perfect. And then in early July, we'll be consulting again with industry. So using the similar channels that we used before through EST and LCRIG and the LGA to consult once more, make sure that the document is usable, it's user-friendly, make sure that's covering all the areas that we need it to. And then based on that, once that industry consultation is closed, we will do some more redrafting and go back to the technical committee, iron out those final points, make sure it's easy to read, and then look to publish this in late 2021. Post-publication, we're looking at how we can really make this a usable document. We don't want to just produce a piece of guidance that sits on a shelf. We want to make sure that people can actually use it. So we're looking at e-learning software that we could upload this onto and create a more engaging way of using it going forward. I think that's probably where all I need to cover for the local authority guide piece at the minute. So yeah, if you can go on to the next slide. I'm happy to take questions in the Q&A section and then the panel discussion, or you can drop me a line at this email. Thank you.
Brilliant, that's great. Thanks, Antony. I mean, it's fantastic to see kind of, I guess, the progress that's kind of being made on this, and also how sort of OZEV is kind of taken on board sort of from EVET, both I suppose the initial challenge that was sort of set out there as this being an issue, and then kind of moving that forward, but then also sort of practically how the guidance can be both, I suppose, delivered efficiently, but also then can factor some of those points that we were sort of raising earlier about how you ensure that it's got longevity and is kind of kept up to date. So that's kind of great to see the progress. And I think now what we're doing is we're heading to a quick panel discussion session. So if Antony, Cheryl, Jonathan, and I think also we've also got Steve Halsey from UKPN, no relation, I have to say, joining us for the panel discussion to give us a network operator perspective. If people do have any questions that they would like to put to the panel, if they can put them in the Q&A box, I'll happily sort of try and pick out and relay any questions from that. I can't see kind of any in there at the moment, and if the Green TV team can just tell me if it's my technical incompetence that is meaning I'm not seeing any of the questions. But what we'll perhaps do is if we perhaps stop sharing the slides and we'll just have kind of everybody back on camera, and then I'll perhaps just try and kick off kind of with a few starting questions, and we'll kind of get the conversation and discussion going from there, and I'll try and ringmaster as best I can. That we've got a relatively small group, so I think we should be able to sort of navigate the kind of who wants to speak. So, I mean, it's obvious that there's lots of stuff happening in this space, which is, I suppose, great given the kind of net zero challenge and the timescales we're talking about and the important role of decarbonising transport. But also it feels a little bit challenging in regard that there's obviously going to be lots of stuff happening in parallel. You know, Cheryl highlighted in her slides that we've got multiple concurrent processes that are going to be very difficult to align in the timescales that we have. So I just kind of wondered, you know, what the panel thinks are kind of the biggest kind of obstacle to us kind of achieving this sort of better coordinated, better planned kind of future that we're aspiring to. What's the big ticket item that the panel feels needs kind of tackling and kind of us to kind of go at, building on what we've discussed here today. Anybody want to have a go at that one first? Or I'll pick.
Yeah, I'm happy to go.
Yeah, go Anthony, you go.
Yeah. So I think the key one in my mind is kind of data and information sharing, particularly data sharing. I mean, that could solve a lot of these issues, couldn't it? If local authorities had access to D&O data much more availably, or vice versa for that matter, as Cheryl pointed out in her slides, it was the maps weren't corresponding. If that could really be easily accessed, I think that could make the world of difference to local authorities in helping them roll out this infrastructure.
Yeah, that's a great one, Antony. And I think it's one sort of echoed in a number of different spaces about this, just access to information. And Steve, I guess from a D&O perspective, you know, obviously as I suppose both a gatekeeper of some of that data, but equally an organisation that probably wants access to data yourselves in various, you guys, in understanding what's going on. How do you see that from a kind of D&O perspective? What do you see as the big challenges for you, but also, I guess, you supporting that wider kind of decarbonisation ambition?
Yeah, I think, I mean, Cheryl touched on it in a slide, didn't she? And I think even I think this first slide that was put up where the chief exec made a comment, it's about coordination and coordination, not just in sort of the traditional way, but certainly coordination across transport and ourselves in a way that hasn't happened in the past. Yes, we've coordinated and worked with transport authorities, typically when new roads are being built or diversions are required, but that tends to be at a more macro level. I think we've got to take that down a level and certainly start looking at that local, the LV level, which is where we're going to see a lot of the connections being made by local authorities and for on-street charging, but homeowners for their own individual suppliers as well. So I think it's about taking some of that bigger stuff down, learning from that, and making sure that information generally, whether that be data, whether that be information on more general things like charger sizes, differences between vehicle to grid, and generally just electric vehicle charging, a whole raft of stuff there, but fundamentally coordinating and getting the information out there to those that need it.
Yeah, I think that's. Do you feel, I guess, from your perspective, that you've kind of got the backing from the regulator to kind of take that step into going to that next level of detail and granularity? I think obviously Cheryl was alluding to, and you both alluded to, this need to go from the sort of strategic macro into that next layer of detail. And obviously that does have, I guess, resource requirements. It has a degree of additional layer of depth of information. So do you feel that the price control that we're heading into is providing the conditions to do that? Do you agree in that regard?
Is that still back to me, Richard?
Yeah, Steve, yeah.
Sorry, okay, yeah. So yeah, I think, I mean, as it's probably well known, we're all putting our plans together for ED2 at the moment. I think end of this month, early July, we've got to get a draft in, and then at the end of the year. And it'll be absolutely no surprise that there's mention of electric vehicles, low carbon technology, funding for those in all of those plans. So yes, absolutely key that we're doing that. As part of the project for open networks for the Electricity Networks Association, there's an awful lot more coordination between the transmission operators and the distribution network operators. A whole system planning talked about. So we're moving into a completely new space, I think, now in terms of how things have been done traditionally and the new way of doing things.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. And Jonathan, I guess from your perspective at Zemo, you guys are obviously plugged into all facets of the kind of complex landscape, and I guess you very much see the kind of almost the moving and evolving stakeholder landscape and the challenges of possibly making the connections. I suppose across, whether it's from electric vehicle manufacturers to local authorities to charge point operators to aggregators. How do you see what's the big things that you see as a real barrier and challenges and things that we need to try and kind of unlock to move things forward?
Well, Richard, I mean, the size of the challenge we face is huge, and what's quite clear is we've got several revolutions going on at the same time here. We've got the revolution in terms of the energy system and how we generate energy, moving to much more renewables, which are more transient. And we're at the same time, we're electrifying transport, adding a huge extra load. At the same time, in parallel, we're also electrifying or cleaning up heat as well, which is going to be putting on a new load. And this is completely new. It's a huge challenge. We've got to bring together sectors that have never worked together before. We've seen the challenges in terms of the planning. It's not insurmountable. We've gone through the process of identifying where the barriers are and identifying where the priorities are. We can tick them off. I think quite rightly, Antony sort of pointed to data as being a real key one, and it's been one of the core areas for a vet in all its working is data. Data at huge different levels, because we're going to be talking about a smart energy system, working with a smart EV charger to charge a smart EV and allow consumers to make smart decisions. To make a smart decision, you need good information to make those decisions on. So, any data is going to be king. Whether it's going to be high frequency data, real-time data to make decisions, or data that's needed for good planning decisions. And we've got to provide the frameworks in which this data can be shared across groups. Understand, the energy system has gone through a process. There's a parallel task force that's been working alongside us, the Energy Data Task Force, and came out with strong recommendations about open data on the energy system. And that really comes down to sort of setting the benchmark down to the meter. Beyond the meter, and that includes the EV, we need to share that data there as well. So these are all important issues, but I think probably the most important one identified by Cheryl earlier on was those, in terms of the investment decisions we need to be making, is getting the right format and the right structures to provide that information in the first place, so that the appropriate planning processes can be coordinated and make good decisions.
Yeah, and I think that ties really strongly to that point about common language and kind of what's needed, kind of how can we ensure that we're talking the same language when we're talking about some of this stuff, which, we all fall into our little sort of silos. And Cheryl, I guess then from your perspective, kind of in the West Midlands, what's your big ticket ask, as it were, that you think could help unlock some of this stuff? I suppose it's what's the barrier, but yeah, you alluded to some sort of things that maybe more support is needed. There is more that kind of can help kind of unlocking and tackling some of these challenges. So, your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, for me, it's about roles and responsibilities, actually, for the main reason that you're talking to organisations that are regulated. You're talking to organisations that sit within a national framework. And that have specific roles and responsibilities to deliver certain things. And those things aren't net zero. They are a whole range of other responsibilities upon which net zero is added. So to be really clear who needs to do what and how, I think is actually really important, because you can have a lot of people doing the same thing and a lot of wasted effort otherwise. But we're talking about a spatial planning system where we have to respond to the national planning guidance. If that national planning guidance doesn't enable the local area to work effectively and deliver the sorts of things we're talking about, that can be a real barrier. You're talking about a transport department that's responsible for delivering specific transport objectives for DFP. If those objectives aren't aligned with the net zero objectives, they're not measured against them, and they're not funded in the right way, you can have adverse outcomes. We've already talked about Ofgem obviously regulating the DNO and their role. So I think it's in a post-pandemic world where resources are really constrained and everybody has to focus on the thing that they have to do, making net zero something that people have to do, I think, is really important, and making sure that people are really clear on how to collaborate and their roles and responsibilities within that will then mean that data is well used, it's put into the right systems, and et cetera, et cetera.
I think that's right, and I guess it's not just it's those connection points, isn't it? So you can understand who you maybe need to have a discussion with, who you need to collaborate with, and then also maybe the support mechanisms to enable those conversations and dialogues to kind of happen. I guess my concern historically has always been, if you don't have the right balance between national strategy and local implementation, everything ends up a little bit in the middle ground. And I guess, Antony, the work that you're doing there as well, trying to provide supporting guidance, is geared towards helping kind of local authorities and others be able to be better placed to drive forward kind of implementation and to have kind of more kind of information kind of at their fingertips. So I always think that does need balancing with that sort of capacity and making sure that you've got the sufficient kind of horsepower to drive things through. So I think that's a really important point. I think we've got a few questions I'll try and kind of get through in the Q&A. So Jonathan, this is probably one for you. So for somebody who has a solution, a possible solution, I'm assuming, to the infrastructure problem, but has no contacts within the industry, who do you suggest they make contact with to make headway into the space? And I'm assuming sort of the Zemo partnership and
oh yes, yes. So I mean, the Zemo partnership was set up by as a collaboration between government and industry to sort of navigate how we're going to decarbonise transport, and that's both in terms of technology, market structures, looking for opportunities, and it has both an environmental and a business perspective to it. We have a number of people working on innovative approaches, so I'm quite happy if Jerome wants to contact Zemo and myself. We'll take that forward, and there'll be some contact details, I think, on the closing slide. But happy to. We're happy. I mean, and this is one of the great things. Going back to sort of the comment earlier about resources are tight coming out of COVID, but this whole space has a huge opportunity for innovation, for business enterprise, for investment that could really sort of put the economy in a much better position going forward. And it's talking about smart. One of the things we haven't talked about is the communications that goes alongside this. So we're going to have to need really good communication systems as well to support this. So it's a very exciting time to be involved in this. I think it's great.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, just to echo that, I mean, I must confess, having worked in energy forever, I do think there is never a better time to have worked in energy, because it's like anything, when anything's changing, that's when the kind of excitement and opportunity and challenge kind of, which certainly is exciting, isn't it? And I guess obviously, Jerome, obviously reaching out to Jonathan's Zemo team. I'm assuming, Steve, from a network operator's perspective, how do people reach out to you guys where they think they've got something? I guess maybe if it has a kind of network benefit or an angle, what's the connection point into the DNOs? Is that through your kind of innovation programs and projects? Or
yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I was going to say most of the DNOs have got an innovation page or innovation pages on their website, and the details of how to contact on there, and certainly many of those might well be sort of eligible for funding through network innovation competitions, things like that. So yeah, absolutely, innovation pages on all the DNO websites.
Yeah, great, fantastic, and obviously, Jerome, as well. That obviously the Catapult network sort of works extensively, I suppose, across the landscape. So the Catapult network as well can provide sort of potentially either signposting or kind of range of activity that it's doing where there's a particular kind of innovation that's interesting coming forward. Maybe it's on the kind of demand side or kind of upstream side as well. So there's a couple of more questions here. So Paul was asking, in terms of the enabling technology, energy storage could obviously potentially be very critical to overcoming grid constraints in specific locations. In terms of stakeholder mapping and engagement, where does energy storage technology kind of developers fit? And I guess they, as part of the wider sort of system, they're obviously potentially a very important part of that wider sort of energy system kind of landscape, just as generation technology kind of developers potentially are, but obviously an equally evolving landscape. And I'm sort of welcome thoughts from the panel on that. Where should energy storage fit? Is that an important part? Do we need to be sort of increasingly mindful of the role of specific energy storage technologies kind of fitting in? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, Richard, absolutely. I mean, you sort of touched on it in your sort of address there. It was we've started out with wind and solar developers over the last sort of 8-9 years or so, and we're now starting to see storage, as the price of batteries has decreased. We're now starting to see storage as a standalone energy sources, as well as storage being bolted onto existing solar and wind farms, particularly in areas that might be constrained, and when DNOs might be asking wind or solar not to export to the network, then storage is a good way of capturing that for use at a later date. But also, I think it's at a local level and certainly at a small domestic level, we're now starting to see early adopters of solar panels become the early adopters of electric vehicles, and they're now becoming the early adopters of storage as well. And we're starting to see those three technologies at a domestic level all coming along and being part of the mix. So it's big stuff, small stuff, and no doubt stuff in the middle as well.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, I think that's great. I mean, and obviously, lest we forget that, I suppose ultimately an EV is a form of portable storage in essence, a battery on wheels. So
indeed,
how you can enable that as a form of storage to play its part in our system and play a flexible part. Obviously, the EV Taskforce identified smart charging and the ability to access that flex as a potentially important part of a kind of net zero energy system. So that itself seems quite important. And Cheryl, I mean, from your perspective, obviously, Energy Capital trying to support sort of local, sort of decarbonised, smarter local energy systems. Storage, I'm assuming, forms a kind of key part of your sort of thinking, kind of Energy Capital.
Yeah, it's a hugely important aspect. The West Midlands is always likely to be a net importer of energy. So from our perspective, we don't focus a lot on generation, unlike other places I've worked. It's a lot more about how we use the energy and how we get it to us, and then how we store it and use it effectively. As a result, we've focused a lot on smart local energy systems, because what we don't want to do is to see the country generating a lot of electricity from infrastructure, newly built infrastructure that we don't need, if we're only trying to manage those peaks rather than the everyday everyday demand. So storage for us is hugely important part of that smart local energy system work. And I think in terms of the question about where do the energy storage technology developers fit in, there's a number of different ways you can fit in a strategic positioning when we're looking at how to do local energy planning and understanding kind of what's needed where, and understanding the constraints and the potential opportunities that storage can play in solving some of those. But there's also, even at the connections point, when somebody's going in for a network connection for a particular charging capability, actually considering how storage could fit alongside that to enable the request to go through, even if there are constraints at that time, can be really important. So, but I think the DNOs obviously do have a big role to play in creating a market for flexible services, and that's kind of a key thing that's evolving over time at the moment, which we obviously need to see more of.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Cheryl. There's one here from Daniel, a question around lowering speed limits to ultimately reduce demand, and then ultimately that realizing sort of wider system benefits, kind of et cetera. So I must confess, it's probably not my area of expertise, road safety, and but I don't know if there's anybody else on the panel that has a particular view on reducing speed limits. John, with your Zemo hat on, I don't know if there's anything your side, or Antony on the OZEV front, whether there's any sort of thinking to share.
Not specifically on that point. I haven't come across that proposal before. It's an interesting one, I think. I guess fitting into the energy storage piece, the concern ultimately there is the demand on the grid, and whether the grid will be able to cope with the uptake in EVs. That's what the concern is fundamentally in that question. And I think we have strong indications from Ofgem and my counterparts in BEIS that the grid will be able to cope with the uptake, and they're pretty confident of that. And energy storage will play a massive part in ensuring that. So hopefully we won't have to reduce motorways down to 30 or 50 miles an hour.
Yeah, thanks, Antony. I mean, I must confess, I haven't seen any analytical evidence that has kind of extolled the virtues or the benefits of reducing sort of speed, and therefore that having sort of wider, whether it be economic or sort of systemic benefits in terms of EV sort of optimization as part of the wider energy system. So, but maybe you want to have a little bit of a dig about if there is anything sort of murking. A third question for an anonymous one. Is it likely that heavy vehicle charging will be left to local authorities to implement? Cheryl, maybe come to you on that one first. Your thoughts?
This is where I'm wishing my colleague Kate was here, because she knows a lot more about this than me, so apologies. But yeah, ultimately, freight in particular is a real issue that we're having to consider. And this is another example where you have to consider how it fits with the national system as well as the local provision, and that interchange scenario as well, where you go from kind of the large lorries down to the smaller ones, potentially to move things into urban areas. So yes, I think it will probably be left to local authorities to play a significant role in that, but they can't do it on their own. So yeah, there's another one of those classic situations where we need to involve everybody. And I know in our area, Midlands Connect, we've been doing quite a lot of work looking at the opportunities, and the universities are looking at the innovation aspects that potentially sit around that, and the role of hydrogen as well as electricity, etc., etc. So
yeah,
there's a lot of people.
That's a really important point there, isn't it? I think, and I mean, Antony, from your perspective on the guidance that you're doing for local authorities, to what extent does thinking about sort of fleet and heavy vehicle charging kind of feature, or is it very much sort of focused on passenger vehicle and sort of public kind of EV charging?
I think we do have fleet in mind, but I don't think we have heavy vehicles in mind necessarily. So people who take their fleet vehicle home, or possibly light goods vehicles, delivery drivers, etc. Yeah, it might be more of a focus there. And I think, again, like in our strategy document, which is separate to the guide, I think that's more of the focus. Like Cheryl says, HGVs is a much more complex area, and I think the technology in those vehicles is developed. I don't think it is clear that electricity will be the solution for those vehicles. It very well might be hydrogen. I'm not fully clear myself, to be honest. I do know through the Rapid Charging Fund, we're making big investments down the strategic road network. That should be quite key for those heavy vehicles which do transition to electric, and being able to charge. And obviously we have like workplace charging schemes to support where those vehicles are headed. So yeah, I think that's what it is from our perspective.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Antony. And I'm conscious of time. We're almost sort of getting close to 3 o'clock. And just one of the things that's obviously come out, I guess, in this sort of discussion is, I think Steve, you kind of alluded to a bit, that not only is there the issue of the increased kind of uptake of electric vehicles, but there's other aspects that are kind of coming into play that are creating load demands and changes to kind of how the energy that we need. And obviously that's before we throw in things like the potential changes needed around our building stock and heating and industrial kind of energy use. So very much from a planning and coordination perspective, is it a case that we need to think about how public EV charging forms part of the puzzle, and how do we connect it in, or is it something, coming back to the point that was made about resourcing and challenges, is it something where we do just have to recognise we're going to have to compartmentalize? We're not going to be able to kind of handle these things all being seen in the round. So welcome to panel's views. Do we compartmentalize, or is it really worth us trying to make sure that we've got the kind of key buckets joined up, or is that just too hard? So the last couple of minutes, is it worth it, or is it too hard? Who wants to go first?
I'll go first then. So I think from a DNO perspective, I think it's important that we do join all these things up. So we've seen the solar farms, the wind farms at the macro level, as I've said. Things are now coming down to a more local level, and we're going to start seeing heat pumps. I think the recommendation, or the 600,000 heat pumps by the end of sort of the 20s. So that's a significant number of heat pumps. That's a national figure. UK Power Networks have got 3 DNOs across the southeast, so a large chunk of those are likely to be in our area. But again, with heat pumps, it needs to be in the right housing stock with the right levels of insulation, etc. So there's a whole piece that needs to be done in terms of pulling all of that together, coordinating all of that across transport, housing, I mean, all of that level of infrastructure. And when I talk about infrastructure, I appreciate that other people have a different understanding of infrastructure. So yeah, it's that common language thing, and trying to get us all moving in the right direction, albeit at a slightly different pace, I guess.
Brilliant. Cheryl, your vote, join up, or reconcile the kind of compartments. What do you think?
I think it's too difficult to join up nationally. I think it's too big an issue, but I'm 100% behind devolving some of this responsibility and joining up locally, because at a local level, that's what we do. We work from a place-based perspective. So that's at the scale at which you can join everything up, overlap everything. You need guidance and systems in place, and it needs to all link to the national system effectively. But I think government sometimes has to recognise what they don't do well, and cross-departmental organisations are difficult at a national level. But at a place-based level, it works really well. So yeah, my vote is to join up. But
okay, so sort of a regional, local kind of join up, and sort of the interchange to the national silos that are likely to be. I think that's really interesting.
Recognising what you do best, I think, is the key.
Excellent. Antony, anything from you on that, or how do you see?
No, I obviously completely agree. I think trying to be as coordinated as we absolutely can be, and recognizing it is difficult because we all have big policy areas and different focuses. But OZEV sits between BEIS and DFT for this reason. Our BEIS counterparts are in the net zero energy team. They're specifically focusing at looking at this transition, at heat, at EV charging, to make sure that the grid can be planned for well. We engage with MHCLG a lot about new housing stock, etc. So I think, kind of as Steve and Cheryl says, as long as we're all heading in the right direction, that's one step. But further collaboration is definitely needed, and yeah.
And I assume, as you say, that sort of helping kind of places and providing the kind of guidance that you guys are kind of looking at, and providing the supporting mechanisms to be able to kind of do what needs to happen locally is kind of part of that step, isn't it? To kind of help people that join up and coordination.
Absolutely. And I think what Cheryl said, and I hadn't quite said, and I do think strongly, is being very clear what we think those roles and responsibilities should be. Is that I should have made that a bit more clear at the beginning, I think, but yes, that is the key thing. Local authorities at the minute, I'm very aware, don't fully know what our vision for their role in this is, and that's challenging. And I think setting that out will help a lot of this move along a bit quicker.
Yeah, totally. And I guess also, I mean, from a local perspective, obviously you've probably got different levels of ambition around the extent of the role and responsibility that would like to be taken. So it's how you create the right mechanism to recognise that, I suppose, and be able to kind of help and support in an effective way. So that's, I mean, and Jonathan, from your perspective, obviously heavily involved with kind of EVET and embroiled in some of these challenges from various different perspectives. So how do you see that? Is it from your side?
I absolutely get Cheryl's point about a place-based approach being fundamentally important, making sure things come together at a local and regional level. However, and I think it comes back to these roles and responsibilities, there is a responsibility at a national level for government to ensure that there's a framework that brings people together and make sure that we are moving in the same direction at the same pace. This is a once in a lifetime transition we're going through, and we've got to make sure that we do it right. We're not going to do it again in our lifetime. So I think it's worth trying to make sure that we get things aligned properly.
Brilliant. I think. Well, and just fun, I think we're just past 3 o'clock. So I mean, a massive thank you to kind of all of the panel for kind of contributing and the discussion today. It's been fantastic to hear the different perspectives, and I think actually probably quite a lot of consensus and cohesion in terms of direction. Just maybe a few kind of tweaks around how we maybe different perspectives on how we take some of those things forward. But yeah, massive thank you to everybody for joining us for that discussion. And now finally, for the kind of last stint, I'm going to hand over to kind of Andrew at OZEV, who's going to give us a little bit of an update on the local EV infrastructure fund. And then I think we're going to have kind of an opportunity again for some questions for Andrew at the end. So if people have any particular questions, if they want to put them in the Q&A board again, that would be fantastic. And I'll try and kind of pull them out and put them to Andrew. So without further ado, over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you very much for giving me some time this afternoon. Hopefully this will complement the discussion that was conducted earlier. And today I'll be talking to you about the local EV infrastructure fund. This is a fund that was bid for last SR, last spending review, and we were allocated £90 million to support the work of local authorities in transitioning to EV transport for their residents. Many of you will be familiar with the on-street residential charge point scheme, and this will not necessarily be replacing that scheme. In fact, we are planning on running them both in parallel, in particular in the first year. And I would like to start off with a caveat that what I'll present today is subject to change. We're still developing the policies and examining the evidence for the local EV infrastructure fund, and much that I'll present to you today may change by the time that we're launched next year. So the presentation today, I will just go over the current draft aims of the Levi fund, the projects that we could be supporting, And after that, I'll be talking a little bit about the working group that we're putting together in order to help us develop the final policies and the final delivery options. And at the end of the presentation, I'd really appreciate the opportunity to hear questions from the group. And I think it'll be a really valuable learning opportunity for me. So the draft aims of the Levi Fund are to enable the strategic local provision of public EV infrastructure through larger scale on-street charge point schemes and rapid hubs that ensure equitable access to EV charging infrastructure. And I also would like to mention that this is designed to support the vision that will be presented to the country by the infrastructure strategy that will precede the launch of the EV fund, of the local EV infrastructure fund. The second aim is to leverage additional private sector investment. So it's very key to us that we're actually helping to crowd in further private investment. We're not looking to crowd out private investment in any way. And thirdly, we're looking to increase consumer confidence in transitioning to electric vehicles. So this graphic is a little crude, but ultimately it hopefully will help present what sort of projects that we're looking to support. So the on-street residential charge point scheme at the moment is demand-led, and we respond to bids directly from local authorities. And at the moment, if it meets the criteria, it automatically gets the funding up until the point that we run out of budget. This year, we have a generous budget of £20 million, and we're dealing with a lot of pent-up demand from last year, which obviously was affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're seeing very healthy demand for the ORC scheme. And the ORC scheme potentially spans all three types of all three types of project mentioned. So the projects in the first section are commercially viable today. The second tier are projects that are likely to be commercially viable in the relatively near future. And the third tranche is a group of projects which may never be commercially viable. However, it would be valuable towards our ambitions around an equitable rollout. So there is the possibility that we will use the Levi Fund to fund some projects which may never be commercially viable, but do help produce an equitable outcome that is necessary to help residents to transition to an EV. My instinct is that we will be mainly focusing around the second tier, which will be that we'll be helping to accelerate the commercial viability of projects. However, my final analysis will be based upon work that we will do with an expert working group and with research that we will have commissioned by a third-party consultancy that will give us independent data. So the draft objective overall is to support the transition of local public charging infrastructure towards a sustainable commercial model that supports equitable access to electric vehicle use. And I think that the objective will probably remain the same. But again, the caveat is that this will have to be given the final sign-off by multiple tiers within OZEV. And we're also going to be working with the working group. But my expectation is that the objective will probably remain unchanged. So the working group that we're going to be assembling, and actually currently we're assembling the working group at the moment, will be to support us in identifying the market failures and the cases for intervention at the local EV charging infrastructure level. It will help us to develop and test the delivery models that we're looking into. And they will provide us advice on which capital costs should be eligible for funding. And I think that point is actually quite key, because the feedback that we've been getting from local authorities and CPOs and DNOs for that matter have identified a number of capital costs which are very flexible in amount. So for example, the amount it costs to connect a charge point to a substation can vary significantly, and can vary significantly based on place and on the type of charger that we're trying to install in that location. We will also be looking to utilize their expertise, their experience, and their contacts to inform the policy of the fund. So this agenda is probably more detailed than we really need to discuss today, but essentially it summarizes the amount of work that we'll be doing with the working group, and in particular, we'll be examining the different delivery options that we'll be examining. So the next slide might be more interesting for the group, please. So we're examining a number of delivery options, and this extends from reforming and extending the ORC scheme. We are also considering using capital grants in a similar way to the ORC scheme has been used. We're looking at the prospect of maybe using low interest loans to help encourage local authorities to invest in infrastructure. The other option is to use a capital grant with a recycling element. So there will be a push towards encouraging local authorities to go into revenue sharing projects with the CPOs and to recoup the grant for reuse in further projects down the line. There are also ideas around targeted procurement models to assist with the more rapid rollout of EV infrastructure. There are minimum revenue guarantee models that we're also examining. So that would be to encourage CPOs to enter an area that they may not be interested in otherwise, because it might not be deemed commercially viable for them. But if there was a significantly interesting minimum revenue guarantee, it would help them to invest in an area that they may not have otherwise. And that leads us on to patient capital, which I think will be one of the ones that we'll be examining and testing quite closely to see if that is viable. Because one of the advantages of doing that is that it allows the fund to extend further than it would do otherwise. But there are also other risks involved in that, where it increases the complexity of the fund and may make it harder to manage on the day-to-day. There are also ideas around encouraging public-private partnerships between the local authorities and the charge point operators. And we're starting to see this happening more and more naturally anyway. So I think that would probably be just reinforcing a market trend that is happening spontaneously. And I would be very welcome to your questions, please.
Thanks, Andrew. That's great. I mean, really appreciated the sort of whistle-stop tour on kind of where you're at, and there may be questions from the kind of audience as well as from the panel, and I've certainly got a few there. And there's a couple that have gone in the Q&A section. It's a couple of kind of practical ones. So the first kind of one, will the funding apply to Northern Ireland? And is there an option that it could be extended there if it is not?
That's a very good question. Sorry, I didn't mean to be too emphatic. That is actually one of the key things that we're examining. So at the SR bid, it was for England. And then there was use of the, sorry, forgive me, I think it's called the Barrett model or the Barrett formula for determining how much the devolved administrations receive whenever England receives funding from Treasury. Barnett model, sorry, I think it's called the Barnett model. I'm willing to be corrected on that. However, we are examining with Treasury whether or not it's worthwhile converting it into a UK-wide fund. So that is actually one of the active questions that we're examining.
Okay, so that's something you're kind of looking at, and so hopefully potentially it would be able to be extended to Ireland.
But I would be keen to point out that the on-street residential charge point scheme is applicable to Northern Ireland. already.
Okay, that's great, Andrew. And next one, a couple of things around pay. So ask a question for a bit more color on what a patient capital model is. So what that means in kind of your in your view here.
So I'm very glad to have that question, because I think this is one of the more interesting delivery models that we're examining. So the idea there is that we could work with an institution such as the upcoming UK Infrastructure Bank, or with other patient capital investors such as pension funds and insurance firms. And the idea here is to utilize the private capital that is interested in long-term, relatively secure infrastructure investments. Now, EV charging is not necessarily considered low risk. So the Levi fund would be used to help de-risk some of the riskier projects. And a lot of these projects that are at the moment considered market failure would take between 5 to maybe even 15 years to break even. And the idea is that we would have a rolling annual investment that would invest in projects that have between, say, 5 and 10 years before they actually recoup their costs and start going into profit. And then the profits would then go into feeding further future investment. And the idea is that you run a portfolio of projects. So you would have a portfolio of projects of varying levels of risk, but erring towards those which would not be invested in unless there was government intervention to help de-risk the overall portfolio.
Okay.
I'm hoping that I helped to explain that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, and Jonathan, sort of building on it a little bit, as kind of made the sort of analogy to the student loans model, where you pay back when your revenue has sort of risen sufficiently to the point. And I think that's kind of what you're alluding to there, isn't it?
I think that's actually a really nice way of, I think that's a very good analogy, actually, because again, that sort of scheme was designed to be self-sustaining. And this is a similar idea that ultimately the fund would carry on indefinitely based upon recouping the costs from the overall portfolio.
Yeah, okay. That's really helpful. I mean, if there's any other questions, then please do put them in the Q&A, and likewise from the panel. If the panel have got any questions, one from me, Andrew. I'm guessing your thinking on the fund is that the things like the guidance that Antony was talking about, the intent is to try and align the support mechanisms for local areas with the kind of new funding kind of opportunities for delivery of infrastructure, so that you've got almost a package of stacked measures that they all cohesively drive in the kind of same direction. Is that kind of what the thinking is?
Yes, although I would add that actually we're also looking to have the Levi Fund support the aims and ambitions set out in the infrastructure strategy.
Okay.
And that is a key priority of the fund, is that it's supporting the overall objectives set out in the infrastructure strategy, but also wider net zero ambitions of the government.
Okay. Okay, that's really helpful. Okay, any further questions for Andrew? Does anybody have? It's a great opportunity while things are forming to give Andrew some hard or informative questions. So if there are any, do please put them in the Q&A.
I think maybe another way of thinking about it is that it's building on the success of the on-street residential charge point scheme, and also we're looking at potentially much more innovative ways of rolling out the EV infrastructure. But obviously, if we find that our stakeholders would much prefer that we dedicated the money to a bigger on-street residential charge point scheme, that may be what comes out. But at the moment, we're assuming that actually the on-street residential charge point scheme, because it's demand-led, is not is not addressing the market failures that we're starting to see. So, for example, there are areas of the country that are getting far more provision proportionately than other areas of the country, and this is something that we are looking to address with the Levi fund.
So you see the fund could be a degree of coming back to what we were talking about earlier, which you might not have been able to, this risk of a postcode lottery of charging provision, where actually I go to one place and I'm overserved, and I go to another place and my experience is actually, you know, pretty awful, and I feel like I'm really, you know, maybe might stay away from that place, or I might you know, plan my journey differently to avoid that. You're trying essentially to use it as a mechanism for leveling that up a bit.
Yes, I think that's a really good takeaway. It is one of the priorities in our thinking, is how to address the regionality of EV investment, of EV charging investment. So when you're looking at where the private firms are investing, London is the biggest piece of the pie. And then we're starting to see diminishing levels of investment in the regions and in other cities. So we're very keen to use this fund to address that market failure and to try and crowd in private investment and accelerate the rollout in other cities and other regions.
Yeah, and yeah, just a kind of another one from me on that. So do you see then the fund potentially helping places with that sort of planning coordination component as well as the capital delivery, or do you see it very much geared towards the capital delivery, and the planning coordination should be dealt with through kind of other resources? And but, you know, how do you see that sort of evolve, or is that something you're working through?
So at the moment, the fund was given as capital funding. So we would have to prioritize capital funding. But I would be keen to address that point by saying that the energy saving trust that deliver the on-street residential charge point scheme have a team that are dedicated to the ORC scheme, and much of their role is in providing advice and insights in order to help local authorities improve their bids and achieve a better rollout. So I would imagine that maybe something similar would happen with this fund, and that whatever delivery body or delivery mechanism we use would have an element of advice giving and support within it. And I would imagine that would be part of the contract that we would tender for.
Yeah, okay. That's really, so yeah, I think that's obviously my experience is that's worked quite well, having that supporting function to enable, and obviously seems quite important. So it's great that you're sort of think about how that kind of comes forward with this fund as well.
And also I would like to mention that Harry, who's in my team at OZEV, is also quite closely aligned with Antony and working with him on the IET guidance that is coming out later this year.
Okay. Yeah, I think again, that connectivity I think seems really important. So it's great to sort of see how that's kind of connecting up. I mean, there's a question here from Cheryl on the panel actually about how whether you might consider regional rather than local allocation. So rather than something that's at a local authority level, would you look at the West Midlands, I guess, you know, wider areas as a kind of single kind of thing rather than kind of individual local areas?
Yeah.
Authority areas?
I think that is definitely something that we would consider, and actually we've been engaged in by the West Midlands Combined Authority with some of the ideas that they've had around what they would like to do in the future with any potential future bid, and their bid has actually been quite useful in our evidence gathering because some of the business models in that proposal are actually supporting our evidence for the Levi fund.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, I think that's again really helpful as well to see how that's sort of feeding in and shaping kind of where things kind of go next. And it sounds, I think, really exciting, that this is kind of happening and coming forward, that it's learning from some of the kind of experiences before, and hopefully a really exciting sort of mechanism to support local areas with some of the challenges that we've been talking about earlier. So it's great to see that coming forward.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is both exciting and a little bit difficult is that we have, in a way, slightly competing aims. So we're looking to address market failure, but we're also looking to help accelerate commercial projects that wouldn't necessarily happen without government intervention. So it's the level of market failure that we end up addressing. And also the fund is 90 million, which, depending on how you look at it, isn't necessarily a huge amount of money when compared to the size of the task, which is one of the reasons why we're examining models like the patient capital model, where it could be used to help crowd in a significant amount of private investment and therefore have a much bigger impact than it would otherwise if it was just a pure grant fund. The advantage of the grant fund is that it would allow us to be very targeted with its interventions, and it would allow us to be very targeted about where we think the biggest market failures are. But the downside is that it means the 90 million would get used up very quickly.
Yeah, and just on that, so are you envisaging that a world of almost blended solutions where you've got some very specific targeted grant allocations because you've got a very clear market failure, businesses in people won't invest, but we feel it's needed, it's critical, and then areas of kind of blended, as you say, patient capital, or maybe even bundled sort of community and private finance and public finance in kind of some delivery mechanism, or a kind of SPV which has, you know, maybe even an even more complex, sophisticated sort of funding and sort of financing mechanism. Have you seen it, or have you seen it slightly simpler than that?
I think the blended option is certainly one that we'll definitely consider, and we will consider more than one delivery model. The other thing I'd state is that we have an ambitious target to launch this fund next year, and whatever we decide upon will be based on the evidence that we can gather over this summer, and the outputs that we'll be able to get from the working group during this summer. And I think that we will. I would probably have to reserve judgment on exactly what the outcome will be until after we've done all that evidence gathering and all the assessment of the evidence. But my instincts are that it will probably be a blended outcome. So this is only my guess at the moment, based on what research that I've done already, is that I do think that, yes, you have a point. I think we'll end up having with an element of very targeted, focused grants on areas that really need government intervention, and there would be no hope of private investment over the next 10 years, combined with maybe a patient capital model that crowds in private investment to help extend the rollout and extend the impact of this money.
Yeah, great. I mean, thank you, Andrew. Firstly, big thank you for kind of taking the time to kind of go through this today, and obviously really looking forward to kind of hearing more and kind of hopefully the kind of panelists and also the attendees. Obviously, there'll be lots of opportunities for them to kind of connect into the fund as it kind of develops. So yeah, thank you very much for that. We're nearly at time, so I think just from me, a massive thank you to everybody that has kind of joined us today, joined the panel discussions and the presentations that we're giving. It's been sort of fantastic discussion and kind of lots of great questions there as well. In terms of just wrapping up, Jonathan, I think from Zemo's perspective, obviously with the kind of EV Energy Taskforce kind of moving forward, I don't know if there's anything in terms of upcoming webinars and sessions that you would like to kind of highlight as we sort of wrap up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. So there is the final webinar in this series of 4 that we have on Thursday, which will be at the same time as this webinar on Thursday. That will be focusing on the consumer engagement and the consumer experience. That's the only public event that we have going on at the moment, but we please keep a lookout on the EVEnergyTaskforce.com website for further news and events that will be coming up. And if you are a member of the interested, the distribution list for EV Energy Taskforce, you'll get included in any announcements that are coming up. But look out for further announcements about the next phase of the next exciting phase of the EV Energy Taskforce, Part 3, coming to a webinar near you soon.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jonathan. And again, a big thank you to everybody that's joined us today and presented. Big thank you to the presenters. Fantastic. We'll see you all soon.